We are likely going to see a few more people trickle in, but I wanted us to begin on this, which is the last of this academic year's Fraser Center for Workplace Issues lecture series. Most of you know by now, I'm Elizabeth Thau, Director of Labor at Wayne, and I'm here to welcome you and our guest speaker. I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the African American Studies Department, the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and our host, the Reuther Library. I also would be remiss if I did not mention the work of Sean O'Brien and Jamie McQuaid, who are our loyal staff members. I, at one point, was a security staffer, so I tend to think of them in the same one. Anyway, Sean and Jamie and our student interns, Kit Ishma, Katie Navazi, Quinn Perkins, Charlie Roney, and Karen A. Dillard for their support this year throughout all of these events, attending, helping to prepare, and breaking down at the end of our workshops. And then I killed my best line, which is I'm thanking them for their support in this year of many speakers. I also call your attention to two of our forthcoming events. On September 24th, sociologist Allison Pugh from Johns Hopkins, the author of The Last Human Job, will be giving the Bluestone Lecture. And in October, October 15th to 17th, the biennial North American Labor History Conference returns to the McGregor Conference Center on this campus. Please watch for further developments. Our speaker today is Dr. Augustus Wood, Assistant Professor in the School of Labor and Employment Relations, University of Illinois-Urbana-Champaign. Wood obtained his doctoral degree from the University of Illinois in 2020 after receiving his BA at Morehouse College and his MA at Clark Atlanta University. I know there were those of you who were wondering why he studied that. But this is quite a pedigree for him. His experience as a student of Atlanta will have informed his subsequent work, which explores intra-racial class divisions and their intersection with urban development politics. Gus Wood comes today to talk to us today to talk about his recently published book, Class Warfare in Atlanta, Grassroots, Power, and Repression under Gentrification, which is published by University of North Carolina Press in 2025. Some of its reviews called it sound, unapologetic, provocative, game-changing, and cutting edge. This book calls for a not to be missed citation. And indeed, we are fortunate in being able to hear about it and Wood's ongoing research. He's presenting today his lecture, Vine City as a World Trade Center, Structural Violence in Atlanta and the Crisis of the Black Worker Today. I ask you to please welcome Augustus Wood.
So thank you all so much. All the different institutions and spaces that help co-sponsor this. I'm so honored and humbled to be here today. The reputation of the work that you all are doing here, I was saying this earlier, is a model for other spaces, in that one of the things that I think that we have to really focus on a lot more, and I know this sounds strange when you go into other scholarly fields, is labor. And it seems like an oversight that people say, of course we talk about labor and working people, but do we really? And so that's why some of the work that's coming out of here is really just doing a lot for pushing an envelope that we have to center workers and labor in general. I'm gonna talk a lot about that today. And the reason why this is the title is that if you read the book, that this is something that the residents of Vine City talk about, and I heard a lot as a kid. I'm a native of Atlanta, and I don't put that in the book because, as me and my editor agreed, I didn't want to put my own personal narrative in the book. I wanted it to be a study because I didn't want people to walk away and say, oh, this is a biased study. But now I can tell people that some of the things that you read about are things that I actually saw personally. And the people I interviewed, some of them are people that I knew growing up that experienced the things you saw in the book. And so it's not just a personal story, but it's also, as I put in the method, it's a critique. That at the end of the day, one of the things that we have to be very cognizant of is that critique is important both in the scholarly space as well as in our community spaces. And I think that's some of the best responses I've gotten from the book is that from scholars to community activists to even local political officials, people are taking the book seriously in that it is unapologetic and it calls out what it needs to call out, but it also calls for specific interventions. The main one being that we have to do everything from perspective of the working classes, the Black working classes. So first, I'm going to go through some of the problems and methodology in terms of writing the book, but then I'm also going to finish with more contemporary understandings of where the crisis lays today. All right. So the problems. So urban scholarship has often hovered at the macro level, positioning the working class as this voiceless, these voiceless objects. You know, when Hirsch's book comes out, The Making of the Second Ghetto, you know, people talked about being path-breaking and transformative, and you had similar books come out that were very similar, looking at other cities. But you asked the question, so what was going on with the people that this most affected? The Black working class Chicagoans, the Black working class Detroit people, the Black working class Atlantans for Kevin Cruz's White Flight. It's like they're just objects being moved around. And that's not a very historically accurate depiction, right? And you see this in urban scholarship and African-American studies and many other books. Also, African-American studies, urban scholarship, and labor studies have largely muted class and labor. Now, what's interesting is that this was an argument I made at the Launcher conference last year, is that we talk a lot about labor and wanting to fight for labor, but where are the working classes in our labor studies? You know, we have a lot of labor studies coming out about human resources. We have a lot of labor studies about global labor entities, but where are the people? Where are the working classes at? You know, you had Joe Trotter's Black Milwaukee come out in 1984, seeking to literally center the working classes in the scholarship. And I argued that there was a conscious move away from what he offered, the proletarianization thesis, that it was a very groundbreaking thesis at the time. And you had a couple of papers here that talk about it, but then there was a silence until Sundiata Chajua's America's First Black Town, Brooklyn, Illinois comes out, and he reinvigorates the proletarianization thesis. Kimberly Phillips, Alabama North also cites it, but then there's silence. And so again, class is typically used as an identifier. It's not an actual point of analysis in a lot of scholarly works. And that becomes an issue because dialectical materialism, or the conflicts between social forces over resources, space, labor, they're not really considered a lot of times when explaining the condition of Black people in the country and the world. So what you typically have, and this happens a lot in African-American studies, is that you have the contextualization of oppression as mostly a cultural or individually based issue, asking us to clean up our own houses first. And if you've been online at any point in the past 10 years, that's all you'll see. And that we should accept that there is a permanence to anti-Blackness. This new thing, well, not new, but relatively new, called Afro-pessimism. This idea that anti-Blackness is permanent, that we will live and die and racial oppression will always be a thing. There's nothing you can really do about it other than to find a way individually to fulfill yourself or fulfill your community and then just live under it. And that's what you get a lot when you don't consider the material aspect of class struggle. Because when you have to deal with the material, that means that you have to deal with the actual ways in which people's lives are affected and then be held accountable to it. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen African-American scholarship position us as a homogenous group, that we all agree on the same thing. You've seen the mayor of Atlanta came out a few weeks ago, and he brought out all the old mayors, the ones that are still around. Shirley Franklin came, and I think Bill Campbell was there. Somebody else was there, and they said, "We're all in this together against the federal government. We're all the real Atlanta." And then the people that grew up in my neighborhood were like, "I don't think you know what you're talking about." In fact, when you say Andrew Young's name in my old neighborhood around Summerhill, they spit on the ground. So again, this necessity to homogenize people, it works against the historical condition for us to study and understand how do we intervene, how do we challenge dominant narratives. And so that's what I was seeking to do with these problems. The key thing is bringing in the Black working class as primary actors in the transformation of space, which doesn't seem like it's a big deal. But again, as I just stated, this is something that at its core, it's not just about giving the Black working class what they call flowers. It's all about showcasing that you can't tell the story, nor can you understand the complexity of urban or rural space transformation without talking about the Black working class. It's literally impossible, and I'm going to explain today why that's the case. So my three key arguments to take away from the book. The first one, subproletarianization, which I define as the intentional underdevelopment and subsequent resettlement of the Black working class into resource-starved metro suburban spaces, is the current social relation of the Black working class majority population to the American empire. Atlanta's transformation into a central hub for the circulation and accumulation of global capital is a byproduct of subproletarianization of Black workers, meaning that Atlanta, to transform into the city it is today, it had to repress, steal, and then resettle Black working class people out of the central city. Both sides could not exist in the same space. I'll explain why in a minute. Number two, subproletarianization is the intended consequence of internal neo-colonialism, financialization of capital through the processes of deindustrialization, mass incarceration, and gentrification, function as capital's reactionary discipline against the Black worker. So I'm challenging the dominant narrative that capitalism was just so brilliant and decided we can make more money by just destroying the factories and financializing everything. We can just do that because there is this tendency to give capital a lot of credit for being just innovative and brilliant, which again has been proven to be false many times in many other works. No, it was a response. It was a political reaction to the rising number of working class rebellions across the globe happening at that time. And Atlanta was one of those hubs where they had worked to erase the narrative. But when you look at what was happening in Atlanta in the 1970s, it was a civil war. There were strikes every day, literally for months on end, to where even international newspapers were saying, what is going on in Atlanta? Black workers are tearing the city apart. So it became that big of a crisis, and it was happening across the globe. Number three, gentrification is a labor crisis first, and is capital's most devastating weapon in internal neocolonialism. It is a structurally violent process that seeks to disrupt or destroy all aspects of the political economy of working class people. It pillages the resources that build capacity for neighborhood social movements. So I'm also challenging the idea that gentrification is solely for real estate companies to accumulate profits. It's not simply that. Once you see the web of the private and public partnerships that come together to gentrify a space, number one, you get the insidiousness of the nasty violence that happens to the people when they lose their materials and lives. But you also see that they go after specific spaces of resources to deplete the sustainability of neighborhood social movement capacity. That is the key thing. That's the dialectic that is often missing from gentrification studies or urban scholarship in general, that there is a dialectic. And we can see the remnants of it today. We can build social movements, but then again, how do you keep them going? There's money involved. There's physical space involved. The shuttering of hospitals and schools, the loss of transportation when you move to suburban spaces, and of course, jobs. I'm going to spend a lot of time on labor because it starts with the labor piece. So these are the three main arguments that I wanted you to get out of this book. Let's talk about method now, because this is how I think methodology is one of the most important things that we have to discuss if we're trying to actually move the fields into certain directions. The first thing I wanted to do is I wanted to do a critique of the political economy. And I'm very clear about that. This is not solely a history book. This is a study. This is a study of a space as a critique at the center of it. Now, if I was going to do a critique of the political economy, I had to study other disciplines. I had to take courses in sociology, geography, political science, economics, anthropology. I had to really get a sense of how urban spaces are social. How do they move? How do the processes actually work together? Because it's a lot of moving parts in Atlanta. And it was very difficult to actually conceptualize how I'm going to do 50 plus years of history in this one book. And so I had to go and learn other frameworks to make this truly interdisciplinary. Now, the other piece of it is, if I'm going to do interdisciplinary work, that's going to affect my source base. And that if I wanted the actual micro level aspects of this study to happen, I had to go to the Black working class. Of course, I don't have to tell you all this, but a lot of urban histories, particularly ones on Atlanta, have focused mostly on using the Atlanta Journal-Constitution because it is the most popular newspaper. Everybody reads it, but it's also one of the most racist and conservative newspapers in history. And in fact, they told their reporters and journalists when the civil rights movement was going on, do not report on it. Keep it, erase it from the mainstream. Nobody talk about it. That's very relevant today. The same thing goes with the Black popular newspaper at the time, the Atlanta Daily World. It was also run by a very conservative owner of the paper that was adamantly in supporting police, in talking badly about movements and protests, etc. So I had to go to the neighborhood newspapers that were around at the time that were actually housed in the Black working class. The Atlanta Voice set up shop right in the neighborhoods of the Black Belt, which were the Black working class neighborhoods, Summerhill, Peoplestown, Dixie Hill. That's where I grew up. And the Atlanta Voice was not solely just a newspaper that reported on the issues affecting the Black working class. They participated in the struggle. When it was time to hold meetings for strikes, they held them in their building. When it was time to pass out leaflets, they did so. They helped train leadership. They did political education. So the sources also participated in the movement capacity. Then we talk about the Great Speckled Bird. And the Great Speckled Bird is easily one of the most profoundly important newspapers to ever come out. You had a group of anti-Vietnam War pacifists. You had anarchists. You had Marxists. You had feminists. You had all these different people come about and say, we're just tired of people getting screwed over by the structure. So let's talk about it and let's use art as a means of doing that. And so for about 12 years, they published the most provocative newspaper. You've ever seen a couple, you can see them online. They were digitized finally. And I would argue that they're one of the cornerstone pieces of breaking the psyche of the bourgeoisie of Atlanta to where they bombed them. They bombed their building because they were so adamant in organizing workers on issues. And we'll talk about those later. So I made sure that the vast majority of my sources came from the very people who had been erased from history. their voices, their struggles, their issues. There's an overabundance of quotes in the book because I didn't want to take the voice from the people and say, well, this is what they said. No, here's what they said. I always get to the Coretta Scott King part and everybody is like, oh my goodness, I can't believe you put that there. I didn't say it. That was quoted directly from the neighbors of the people that live in that neighborhood. I just put the quote there. I let the quotes do the work because the workers, I didn't have to tell them they were working class or they were revolutionary nationalists or socialists or anything. They said it themselves. They saw themselves as an oppressed internal colony. You look at the Atlanta Voice, they're having debates in the Atlanta Voice in the early 1970s, talking about, well, we're colonized. What is capitalism really doing for us? And the capitalists are saying, you're just jaded. We got Nixon in power now. We have a new system with Nixon saying Black capitalism is okay. We should all join in. So they're debating these things for years. So I didn't have to put my own spin on it. The Black workers have always had a class consciousness, particularly at that time. So the sources had to reflect what the purpose and the stakes of the book were. Now, in terms of Chamber of Commerce records, now Chamber of Commerce records are usually ignored in urban studies, but the Chamber of Commerce, I argue from my research, is actually one of the biggest puppeteers in revitalization because anybody with money in these cities is in the chamber. And they have their own planning wing doing, they've worked with the real estate companies called Central Atlanta Progress. And they're the ones that are going to create the plan to gentrify Atlanta in multiple different times. And they just leave the stuff in the archives. They didn't really care. When you go to the Chamber of Commerce records, they proudly promote this Black folks. They're not going to do anything with this land. They're not doing anything in these schools. I mean, seriously, let's just take it. We're going to do so much more with it. And we're going to keep them from coming back in the city too. That's the key thing. It's not about just taking it. It's about keeping them from coming back in the city. Let's cut off the access. If you live on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, I don't want you to be able to come into Olympic Park. I'm going to find a way to keep you out. They brag about it. They were openly talking about it. So reading these types of sources against the grain, I went to some of the real estate companies and I told them, I want to talk about real estate boom in Atlanta. They were all happy, like, here, take it. Not knowing that I was going to read against the grain. It's like, I want to really talk about how violent you all have been against the residents of the city. And so again, my method was clear. And I wanted to do this in a means to challenge with historical materialism. Because history is not random nor organic. A lot of urban studies will have it to where if there's no material, then things can appear to be random. People can just be smart. Things can just move. People can just find land. People can just do all these things randomly. But the material keeps it connected and shows it's a process with a lot of moving pieces and different groups involved. So that's why I wanted to use historical materialism as the basis of my methodology. That we have to go back to studying the material of the working classes. We have to put it at the forefront if we're truly going to discover what is happening in these spaces, especially now as gentrification has now become, unfortunately, a norm in society. It's unfair, but I guess it's inevitable. I hear that all the time with city council members when I talk to them. It's an inevitable thing. No, it's not. This contradicts that. And of course, I've already talked about this, but the dialectical part of it, that it is really truly over a conflict, because we're often told that working class people don't hold institutions. They're not organized. The Charles Payne book, I Have the Light of Freedom, that book comes out and it's like, oh, it's a revolutionary book about civil rights. But if you read the last few chapters of the book, Charles Payne joins in Claiborne Carson and saying, well, when it came to Black Power and then those damn students started organizing, it was such a mess because then the working people, they don't know anything. They're lazy. The students didn't know how to organize and it was a mess. Again, this is all ridiculous and ahistorical because of a lack of respect for working class people. Because when you actually look at the working class, then you find out
No, this was a struggle. There was a battle over who controlled the city. And it was well organized, something to talk about later. But I believe that dialectical materialism, showcasing the conflict between social forces, is the best means for us to truly get an accurate depiction of not just what happened in the past, but what's happening right now. It's about resources, it's about material. So, final part about my methodology is that the stakes are, and I've already talked about this, I look at how microstructures, neighborhoods, households, organizations, how they produce more salient understandings of how systemic dereliction operates at all levels of society. Yes, we know capitalism exploits. Yes, we know at a structural level, it's this global, but how does it work on a day-to-day basis from when somebody gets up in the morning to when they go to bed at night? How do we actually understand the insidious nature of the process if we don't look at all levels? It's not easy to do. It's a hard balancing act, but you have to consider it if we're serious. And that's what I'm trying to say. We need to be serious about this. This project conceptualizes urban space as a fluid social process itself, where the interaction of material and human environment form the circulation process of capital. The fluidity is important. This is a class warfare, but class is very fluid. And I make that clear in the introduction. Maynard Jackson could go out after a kid is shot by the cops and say, how dare this happen? This is the worst thing ever. And the people cheer him on. They see him in the public denouncing police murder. But then the very next afternoon, he gives $2 million to the police. The public doesn't see that. But you see what I'm saying is that there is a fluidity to how complex class operates, especially when you're talking about a war. That's why I use the title warfare, because both sides are getting victories here or there, and it's still going on. But we have to understand it as such and make it complicated and uncomfortable, because that's what I always get about the book. It's so uncomfortable. Is you talking about things, Martin Luther King's father doing this and Craig Scott thing? It's like, yeah, do you imagine how comfortable it was for those hundreds of workers who lost their job when Martin Luther King Sr. helped break that strike, and how they were mailed empty job applications, teasing them when they couldn't find jobs anywhere else and their pensions were bust? I'm sure they felt uncomfortable too. So again, it's about the working classes. It's about putting them at the center. Now let's get into the actual book itself, starting with the Black Belt. This was the Black Belt in the 1960s, early 1970s. And this is it today. So I don't know how we can look at this other than warfare. Like the literal cleansing of a space. Where my family grew up, and it's not technically in the book, but we were gentrified when I was in high school to Douglas County. If you read the final chapter, you notice the emphasis on Douglas County as one of the spaces of self-proletarianization. Is because that's where I finished my high school career. There's nothing there. To this day, there's still nothing there. But it's like almost 80% Black now. There's a reason. It's intentional. But again, this is what we call the Black Belt. So these are the historic Black neighborhoods that were left after the Highway Act put a highway through Auburn Avenue, which was considered to be the Black, I'm not using that term mecca because it's whatever, the Black business center of Atlanta, and they put a highway right through it. And we'll talk more about that later. So you got the working class neighborhoods. Now, when they first opened, the working class neighborhoods, the question is, why do they keep building things on Black neighborhoods? And of course, people say the easy answer is racism. Sure, we don't care about them, so we should build stuff there. But I argue it's a little bit more deeper than that. It's not just about we don't care about these people, but it's also the threat of rebellion. That by removing resources, it's more easy to dominate people under a colonial subjugation. So there's also that part of it. So accumulation matters, yes, but there's also repression that makes up the colonial project. So one of my main frameworks in the book is internal neo-colonialism. It was developed by Amilcar Cabral, Kwame Ture, Charles Hamilton, Robert L. Allen in the great book, Black Awakening in Capitalist America, where he prophesies what this is, that the majority of the Black population in the United States is politically, economically, and militarily subjugated to the American empire. Much like the colonies in Africa or Asia were colonially subjugated and under direct control from European powers. Now, colonies can be internal, like the indigenous reservations or urban ghettos. Now, this is the key part about the Atlanta and other metro spaces, that the colonial relationship and the structures of domination and subordination are key. Sociologists here in Lefebvre position that capitalist domination is being a facet of everyday life concept for urban dwellers fighting for a right to the city. In other words, Lefebvre is saying that the very idea of living in an urban space, you are constantly in conflict with subordination. You're constantly in conflict with your colonial position. And that's what you see when you actually start to notice when the Black working classes come to Atlanta. The first thing they see in the 1960s when they get to Atlanta, because again, you have a lot of sharecropping families who hear of this Atlanta, where people actually have a chance to work in the auto plants. There were 3 auto plants in the city. There were good jobs. You had the meat packaging plant. It was better than a sharecropping life. So you had thousands of Black people from other parts of the South migrating to Atlanta in the 1960s. When they get there, they see places like East Lake Meadows that was built in this shoddy, disgusting, decrepit way. They see that jobs are still putting Black people in the worst, dirty conditions of the factory. They see all these things. They're firing all the Black teachers in public schools without community input. They're closing sectors of hospitals. And when you try to go to the grocery store to buy food, the meat is always spoiled and they don't hire from the community. So Black working class people made a conscious decision that we have to take back our power if we're going to be able to determine what happens with this city. They were smart. They knew that Ivan Allen, who was mayor first, then Sam Massel, always were talking about we can go global. We have this airport and we can expand it. But what about a Congress Center where every country can come and meet and hold events? We have to be able to build Atlanta bigger. The Black workers were conscious of this. So what begins is a push. And this isn't just here, it's here where you all are in Detroit as well, because the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and other working class groups here had connections with Atlanta Black workers. It's in Chicago, it's in all these other spaces. So in the 60s and 70s, the critique was at the point of production with labor strikes. And it was about the point of production that there was an exploitive nature of production. So the response, we got to stop this. We got to replace direct control of Black colonies with indirect rulers from the Black community to act as the junior partners of capitalism. Because right now, you're discrediting the control and culture of the American empire when you critique the point of production. If we have junior partners plucked from the oppressed group to serve as middle management, to serve as junior partners, administrators, city council, mayors, lawyers, where they can defend the interests of the empire, then we have a new colonial project, reshaped colonial project. So I want to be able to defend pro-growth or the pillaging of community and state resources to deepen the colonial relationship. So that's what you have happening when all these Black workers move to Atlanta and they say, we're going to take over the space. And it's through the prism of Black power. Now, Black power was often thought of as not happening in the South, that it was told that it was a Northern phenomenon, that when they tried in the South, the poor Southerners didn't have what it takes to organize, that they had to take it out to California with the Black Panther Party. They couldn't do it in Alabama or Georgia. Well, again, a lot of those works did not use sources from the Black working class, because once you dig into those sources, Black power was actually way more defined and more critical than people originally thought. So I'm challenging the dominant discipline of a subfield of Black power studies. And then no, not only did it happen in the South, but it was well defined. There were 4 prisms of Black power that were clear in their ideas. Now, they're very different, and they were often in contestation, which is the point of the study. But I wanted to be clear that even the ones like conservative nationalism, they had a point to where they believed that they could honestly give power to Black people through capitalism. They did. The first group is the one that did not have a political foothold in the city, the cultural nationalists. They were the ones that actually participated in different groups. So they didn't have their own specific movement like the other 3 did. So let's get to the big one. The first big one, conservative nationalism. They said Nixon supports us now. We can get a piece of the American pie. We've never had this before. How dare you challenge the American system that finally let us get money to build power through capitalism? And that was the big push in the scene. Now that we have access to funds to have Black capitalism, let's use Atlanta as a model. But how do you get there? They align with the liberal pluralist prism of Black power, which means electoral politics. Voting is the solution to giving Black people power. So let's get supportive, let's get pro-Black capitalist people into office to allow us to have our slice of the pie. So that was the liberal pluralist prism. But then you had the revolutionary nationalist prism. The Black working class said, we want control. We want control. Notice that they didn't say community control. That's something we say now in more of a 21st century thing, Black community control. No, they had a clear definition back then. We want our neighborhood residents to have control over the school board, over the grocery stores, over the hospitals, any space that dictated our lives in some direct way. We want to have decision-making power, plain and simple. So again, the only way to transform society is that we must control the very institutions that affect our lives in our neighborhood. So we want to break down spaces to build power for our communities, right? And they did it through proto-nationalism. Proto-nationalism. This is a tactic where if a grocery store is selling bad meat, we boycott the grocery store and we give a list of 3 demands. Number 1, you must hire within our community. Number 2, you must buy fresh food daily or weekly, depending on what the food is. And number 3, you must give a share of your profits to the residents in the community, because you exist in our neighborhood and yet you do not contribute to our neighborhood. So this is why this was revolutionary. They were trying to reallocate resources and build power for different groups in the neighborhood. And this also lifted social movement capacity. Now, and again, if you read chapter 1, you saw how they went from grocery store to grocery store to grocery store, shutting them down left and right and taking victories with them, building their movement capacity. It's like, we got something here. Let's actually turn grocery stores into Black controlled cooperative spaces. And we know they were talking about this because they were reading Marx, they were reading Fanon, they were working with the Students for the Democratic Society. They were working with all these other groups. So they had socialist principles at the base of their revolutionary nationalism. Their nationalism was based in their idea that we are a colonized nation within a nation. And to break that nation, we have to create a socialist revolution. That was the Black working class in Atlanta. And I suspect if it's done in other cities, you're going to see the exact same thing coming out of those cities at this time. So a couple of pictures here. For Black to have our way, first we must send the white away. You had the Black student protest, where it wasn't just neighborhood residents, it was their kids leaving school, boycotting spaces, demanding Black History Month, demanding that they hire the principal, that they come out of the neighborhood. Again, decision-making power, you're wresting control away. That's proto-nationalism. You're giving power to the nation that's occupied. And I always talk about this one because every time I talk about this in Atlanta, I've done like 8 talks in Atlanta. They say either I was there when it happened or I had no idea this ever happened. There's no in between. But the Church's Chicken strike of 1972, where Church's Chicken across the city, which was one of the most popular places, was shut down completely by the great Eva Davis of East Lake Meadows. And if you notice that the vast majority of the heroes of the book are Black working class women. And I'll talk more about that. But again, the data doesn't lie. They were leading and strategizing the most effectively during this period because they told Church's Chicken, you're in East Lake Meadows, so you got to pay a tribute to the residential community because they had built these resource spaces to kind of improve the neighborhood. And y'all got to pay y'all part. You can't be in our neighborhood. We're going to keep you shut down until you close forever because we're not getting any benefit. We're not getting any benefit. You're not hiring our people. And the people you are hiring, you're exploiting because they don't have a union. So they had 3 demands when they shut this down. Number 1, union. We want a union contract. Number 2, you must hire within our neighborhood. Number 3, you have to give a percentage of your profits to East Lake Meadows. Those are the 3 main demands. And I'll talk about why it didn't succeed in a second. But I just wanted you to see that there were strikes all over the city using the labor strike as a means to disrupt dominated control, particularly at that time by white and Black capital. Now, here's the other part about this. When you dig into the archives, you talk to the people. They use the resources they got from the labor strikes to deal with other community problems. Because if we have a housing issue, and we have a policing brutality or surveillance issue, if we have any other kind of issues, we can use the union hall. We can use the pamphlets. We can use all these things to create an actual social movement for Black working class people. So they were able to marshal resources through the attack at the point of production. Very strategic use of resources. That's what scared the upcoming new middle class leadership that have been selected to take over the city, like they did here with Coleman Young. That working class folks aren't just fighting for civil rights anymore. Now they're a problem because now they want power. And I was just talking with a colleague about this the other day. Notice how people don't use the word power anymore. They were clear. We want decision-making power over what happens to the city of Atlanta. You're going to see this throughout the decades, going into the Olympic era, where the ANUP organization said, you can't just drop a stadium. I don't care if it's for the Olympics in our neighborhood without our consent. That's the narrative in our struggle, is decision-making power. Even though we lost resources in the 80s from Andrew Young and Reagan, et cetera, the argument remained the same, decision-making power. And I already talked about this. They were trying to build what Alden Morris calls a local movement center or an agency Latin center, a space that housed resources, trained leadership, did all these things so that you can sustain social movements. They were very clear that we wanted to always sustain social movements. Leadership, buildings, money, all those things, right? This is important for what's about to happen. Because now the Black urban regime comes along, developed by political scientist Adolph Reed Jr. in the 90s. He created this idea of the Black urban regime that was dedicated to pro-growth. He was challenging the urban regime theory. and said, no, it's different than that because you have to have a relationship with your constituency. You can't just run simply off of building the city because then the people will forget about you. You have to promise things. You have to always wave a carrot. You have to be out in the front. You have to showcase and propagandize you're as oppressed as they are. So this is why this is important, because once you see that we're fighting at the point of production, the backlash occurs. Capital starts targeting the point of production. So they start erasing the radical critique from groups like the Meade Caucus rank and file workers from Chapter 1, or the Black working class women from Howard Johnson, Church's Chicken, etc. They do this by going after the leadership. Ron Carter, the head of the Black Panther Party in Atlanta, they raided his house so much they drove him crazy. Like they put him in jail repeatedly. They did all these horrible things to him, and he died because of the onslaught from police repression. Eva Davis, who did all this great work for Eastlake Meadows, they said that no, she got to go. So they locked her up a bunch of times too. They hurt her character in the community. They did this with a bunch of leaders. John Africa, who did a lot of the great organizing around schools. They fired him from his job and they barred him from spaces in the community. So they directly targeted leadership that was important for building this power. By the late 1970s, significant losses of radical militancy for multiple reasons, it crushed the bargaining power for the Black working class. And of course, the most famous one, the 1977 sanitation strike, where some of my family members were a part of that. And you read Chapter 2, you saw how extensive it was and how powerful the strike was going before Maynard Jackson gave Ronald Reagan something new that he could do. He fired all the striking workers and crushed the union, just like that. So no, Reagan does not get credit for doing it first. It was Maynard Jackson in Atlanta who did it first, with the help of Martin Luther King Sr. and other Black civil rights leaders like Andrew Young. They crushed the labor power. And these were, again, this is the one thing that really hurt Black working class Atlanta more than anything else, because they had a relatively strong union presence before this strike. And this is what really set the unions down the path. And I give examples in the book of other labor unions that tried to organize, but again, they never got back to that power because of the repressive nature of Maynard Jackson, who also set the police unions against the workers. Well, we see that everywhere, but you get my point though. And that's one of the reasons why Maynard Jackson was selected, is because he was law and order first. He told the business owners in the Chamber of Commerce, I'm going to do whatever it takes to make the Atlanta you want. And that's what he did. And he had some accomplices. Here they are. The Black Urban Regime. And I couldn't put them all up there, but I put the main ones. They are a structurally violent organization who consciously finance and globalize capital to embed internal neo-colonialism, meaning they all participated in extracting labor spaces, livable wage labor spaces from the city. State resources, that's Shirley Franklin, because she was part of the privatizing of public schools movement in Atlanta. She herself was a owner of charter schools and private schools. How she was allowed to do that at the same time? Well, I think at this point in our history today, I don't think corruption and contradiction matters much. And these people in the White House were not the first to do it. They were doing it back in the 90s. Andrew Young, of course, and we'll talk more about him in a second. But the key thing here is that how they always propagandized what they were doing as good is that this was about pro-growth, that we're going to make the city better, we're going to make it more accessible, but they never asked the question, accessible for who? It was always about growth in reduction of residents. We want to turn this into a space where you don't spend a lot of time in, but you spend a lot of money in. That's the key. Neoliberalization, we'll talk more about that in a second. Pillaging of urban spaces. So the first thing that has to happen now that we've gotten labor spaces starting to crush, you saw auto plants starting to fall down, the meat plant closed, all these other relatively livable wage spaces start to fall, the unions lose power. But now we got to do the pre-gentrification stuff because the real estate companies, they're not here yet. They're off chilling. We got to do something else first. We got to criminalize the working class. Here it is. The militarization of the Atlanta Police Department. So this was a flyer that was sent into every mailbox in Atlanta to let you know, this is what we're going to do to you. Yeah, and they made sure to make that the cops should be black on this cover. So Maynard Jackson, Andrew Young, they put more money into the police than almost anybody else in the country at the time. They create multiple new units, State Squad, Red Dogs, and y'all know about stress. They stole stress from Detroit. So again, you see a lot of this repressive policing come out, and it's not just, of course, Maynard's thing is crime, crime, crime. Every paper in his archive, he's giving a speech on crime. He's not doing it because crime is a literal problem. He's doing it because when you propagandize crime, you drop the property values. You know what's coming next. Buy it up for cheap. And here's what they did. Just like in The Wire, which is why The Wire is so brilliant. They took it from a real situation. They moved all the underground economy work, the drug dealing specifically, to specific parts of the city that they were going to gentrify. And we know this because the FBI raid in 1994 showed that this is what they were doing for decades. That the police were not arresting or going after crime. They were making money off of it. So you have to talk about police militarization and surveillance when you're talking about gentrification, especially in the early parts, because they're often separated, and we often talk about policing in terms of the murders. And yes, if you read chapter 2, there's a ton of murders. They had one cop that killed like 6 people in like 2 months and never had this, they just let go. We had a police chief who clearly was a Klan member who was kept in power. But we never talk about surveillance. We never talk about the property value and land value aspect. When you keep going on TV over and over again saying Atlanta's a murder capital or the dangers of living in Atlanta and all these other things, you're plummeting the property value. When you set it up like Simon Balto's book into an occupied territory where the police are literally stationed in your neighborhoods, and they're going after everyday residents, claiming that your cousin's cousin was a drug dealer. So I'm putting you in jail too. That's what's happening in Atlanta. And it's paving the way for the people to buy things up. Now, as I mentioned before, step 1, target the radicals. That happened. Step 2, militarize police. Step 3, shut down community centers. So all the community centers where people were doing things in the neighborhood, they get eviction notices. We can't have those rec centers anymore. They're all closed. This is not simply to gentrify those spaces for money. It's because those are spaces where you have public access to things, right? For the working classes. Schools evicted, bombed the Great Speckled Bird. That's the picture the day after the Great Speckled Bird was bombed. Right in the heart of the Black community. Why? Because they were acting as a hub for working class struggle. They were a resource. And they never recovered from this bombing because the cost to rebuild was too much, and they folded a few years after this. Again, you're talking about one of the most powerful spaces in the city. And it's an open secret that the police bombed. Right? Number 4, propagandize crime in the national media. I told you before, they called Atlanta the murder capital of the world. Well, I did the research. They juked the stats. They juked the stats. It was not the murder capital of the world. One of the richest people in the city, Dylan Munford, he helped pay to juke the stats to say Atlanta was the murder capital. Not true. Now, you see all this stuff happening? They're spending all this money and doing all these things. The police are everywhere, all this money, right? So how come there's so much money? There's so many police, and none of them can stop the murder of the children in the city. They're there. They're occupied in the Black working class. but the children are being murdered every day. Where are the leadership? They're in Japan. They're in Germany. They're selling Atlanta. You can go and see it in the archives yourself. The brochures are there. It's not reported in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but they're in Nigeria during the Atlanta child murders. Well, don't believe me? Here's the quote from the woman who actually is the hero of the Atlanta child murders. There was a case of hepatitis or widespread epidemic, the mayor and everybody else would be all on the TV stations saying, let's get out and find out what happened. But it took Maynard Jackson from July of last year, when the two boys were found at Niskey Lake, to July of this year to create a task force. I know it can't be because we're Black. It's because we're poor. End quote. Camille Bell, one of the greatest people to ever live in the city of Atlanta, risked everything after her son was found murdered. She organized the other Black mothers who had lost their children, and they created a social movement. To this day is the only reason that the murders became a national issue. It wasn't Maynard or any of the official leaders. They created a network across the country for funding and talking to other newspapers about their issue. And that's what made it the point to where it became a national crisis, because of what these Black working class women did after getting off work every day and meeting. But the leadership, when they were doing this, they told them it was their fault. You're bad mothers. Your children are sex workers. That's why they ran away from you. You're a single mother. There's nothing you can do because you just can't raise a child. You're pathologically backward. That's the stuff coming out of the mayor's office during this time. So it's not just about the accumulation. This is why I emphasize the repression and the warfare, y'all, that it's also a dehumanization. That if you're going to take things away from people like housing, food, water, access to spaces, you have to turn them into non-humans. So it's all part of the same process. All part of the same process, and we're seeing this today. Now, as we move on, gentrification, like I said, you destroy the labor base and you start to look at some of the other puppeteers. So the Black urban regime was not just the local leadership. You also had Central Atlanta Progress, the Atlanta Braves, Georgia Tech University, Georgia State University, the Arthur Blank Foundation, the Atlanta Falcons, the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games, and of course, the CDCs, the nonprofit community development corporations. We're going to talk a lot about them in a second. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on rent theory because I don't want to really give you all that fun stuff, because I think I have you now. I don't want to lose you in going into theoretical with this, but I will explain it to you in a basic way and leave it alone. So when land property owners add an intrinsic change to the production process and add surplus profits to the original accumulation cycle. So in other words, real estate corporations revamp the housing market with this in mind. They work with local governments to reduce the subsidized housing available with the increase in low quality apartment complexes. So you had the building in next to these very rich spaces. You had the Gold Coast and Cascade, where Evander Holyfield, Oprah Winfrey, and all these other Black rich people moved to. And right a few blocks away, you had these tenement, really beat up looking apartments built very low cost stuff. And you know what they're already thinking about. Public housing must go away, but they're not there yet. They're thinking it, but it's not there yet, right? So you have cheap amenities and building costs added to the potential ground rent. So I'm going to put a fitness center in your complex that has maybe one treadmill. It may work, doesn't matter. It's there. You pay extra rent for it. That's manipulating your rent, right? You put laundromats in there. You put other parts and amenities there so you can charge extra, get surplus profits. And that becomes the basis for a lot of the building in Atlanta, right? Additionally, locational advantage adds to the capitalized ground rent. So I can charge more if I build your spaces by Georgia Tech University. You're in front of a world-class institution. Of course, I'm going to add $500 to your rent. You're next to Georgia Tech. Or if you're next to Olympic Park, I'm going to add $2,500 because even if you're by Olympic Park, there's a good chance you can see a celebrity out your window. That's worth an extra $2,500 a month, don't you think? Seriously, this is what they're talking about. If you look at the Chamber of Commerce records or the Wall Street Journal at the time, all these spaces are talking about that, right? So here's how this works. You have the expansion of the international airport. Then you have the creation of the Georgia World Congress Center, all these things, gentrifying projects, the overseas recruitment of capital and banks. And I spent a lot of time in chapter 3 talking about how they really went after banks so that by the end of the 1980s, you have most international bank headquarters in Atlanta. I mean, it was a quick turnaround. And number 4, the Olympics. And this is why I make the argument that the Olympics expedited something that happens gradually later in other Black cities, that they had to test the market out. Can we have a 24-hour tourist market, a city without the Black working class? They tried it, it worked, so they did it again, this time permanent, but there's only one way to do it. The end of public housing in Atlanta. By 2015, Atlanta had demolished all 14,000 federally subsidized public housing units and exposed so many people. And this story is heavily talked about in the final chapters of the book because it is a really horrific story in how the Black working class, especially at a time when the economy had completely destroyed working class jobs that even looked like they could pay something. They were fighting to keep subsidized housing in the city because nobody could afford to go anywhere. So I go into detail about how the homeless shelters were attacked by the city as well. There's just so much of a rampant attack on working class people who were shifting in and out of what we call the lumpen proletariat, meaning some of them would have to go and steal cars to pay their bills while also attempting to work in a restaurant to supplement. They didn't have DoorDash and Uber and all that stuff back then. So you had to have multiple jobs, sometimes in the class structure, sometimes outside the class structure to make ends meet. But that's what you see happening throughout Atlanta as public housing starts to collapse. Now, again, one of the faculties of this, nonprofits, petty bourgeois activism, because quote, in the nonprofit industrial complex, accountability is directed towards the ruling class and its managers, towards foundations, donors, government officials, larger nonprofits, research institutes, universities, and the media. These are all forms of top-down accountability. I am suggesting a bottom-up accountability guided by those on the front lines of grassroots struggles for justice. In which direction does your accountability lie? End quote. And that's from Paul Kimball, and the revolution will not be funded. And so what you see happen in some spaces today, you do have grassroots nonprofits that are literally not tied to banks or other top-down institutions. But one of the things that we have to talk about in a lot of urban spaces and gentrification is that nonprofits, especially from individual entrepreneurs, played a major part in manipulating the voices of the people. And one of the earliest examples of this was Coretta Scott King working with the National Park Service in the gentrification of Auburn Avenue to create the Atlanta King, the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta. Now, if you know this story, you know the King Center was already the house, the historic house, and it attracted a ton of people, etc. But Coretta Scott King, doing great work overseas fighting apartheid. So not taking that away from her, but she still had a political project here that netted her tens of millions of dollars when she cut the deal with the National Park Service to remove dozens of homes out of Auburn Avenue. And that's one of the earliest examples of the nonprofit industrial complex because she used her nonprofit space to do so. Then you have more as the years go on. So this becomes a major issue. And the idea is this is like, well, if you're against having a King Center and you're against the historical nature of such a powerful individual and figure, man, how are you really going to look yourself in the mirror if you don't support a King Center? So it's a lot of that kind of propaganda. Same way they talk about pro-growth is if you're against it, you're backwards. if you're against these types of spaces that manage poverty, that manage inequality instead of resolving it, then you're backwards or you're irrational. They told you you don't need to protest anymore. Like, why would you protest? We now have management spaces. We have the Summerhill Community Development Corporation where we're worth millions of dollars. We'll manage your problems in Summerhill. But going to protest, that's 1960 stuff. Remember what Jay-Z said? We're beyond kneeling. You know, I work with the NFL now. We don't kneel. Interesting. So I'm gonna end the talk today on the current status, subproletarianization. So what I mean by subproletarianization, and again, this is an expansion of Joe Trotter's proletarianization thesis, in that subproletarianization is a reactionary process to discipline working class people who are typically dark-skinned. So I'm not saying that white working class people cannot at some point experience subproletarianization, but the overrepresentation of dark-skinned people in subproletarianization, you just can't ignore it. So Black working class is displaced from its community and resettled in labor-starved spaces. The dominant form of labor in these areas, low wages, does not meet the cost of living or inflation. The hours are unstable. Walmarts, dollar stores, all these spaces where they post your hours on the door. I washed dishes in high school, and I remember those days where you just had to hopefully count that you were going to get 20 hours that week, or you were going to hope that you could meet full time so your benefits will kick in. And if you talk to workers at Walmart today, they manipulate their hours so they can't get their health care and their benefits. That's what we're dealing with. Lacks decision-making power over labor. You don't have a say in how you actually work. Lacks collective bargaining power. Non-union. Baristas right now have a ton of unions in Starbucks, but they have no contracts. Lacks benefits, already talked about that, and the labor is typically dirty, meaning it's undesirable by national standards, meaning restaurant workers who work 12 hours a day in many cases are on their feet, always doing stuff, and their bodies smell of that food forever. And somebody that worked in a kitchen like that, I tell you, it takes years to get that smell out of your nose and your body. Meat packers, all these groups where the labor is hard. Warehouse work, you're picking boxes up at a speed in your time. And if you don't make your time, you get a demerit. So you're treated like, if you've seen that movie, they shoot horses, don't they? Some of my older folks remember that classic film. You know, they treat you like a racehorse. They time you. You gotta make that time. The other parts of subproletarianization, you lack the material resources that sustain consistent daily routine. Now, you may have resources, and I talked about this in the final chapter, but in terms of their capacity to sustain, meaning you run out of them quicker now, and other factors that strengthen the use value of your neighborhood. So neighborhood social movement capacity is low when the group horizon has to be built from scratch. So no mass transportation, all of the spaces here. This is where Black Atlantans were moved. All these counties outside the city. And my family was moved here to Douglas County. To get to Atlanta, you have to get on I-20, which is about a 45-minute drive because of the traffic flow, because so many people were pushed out of the city. It's congested, and it's easy to fix this, by the way. Everybody goes to Atlanta and says how bad the traffic is. Trust me, they can easily fix it if they wanted to, but if you make it easier to ride on the highway, you got too many undesirables that have access to the city. So yeah, hard to get around mass transit. Lack of grocery stores within 1 mile of neighborhood. Lack of affordable childcare options. So your daily routine is always, how do I pick up my child? How do I get them from school? How does this work? You always have an unstable environment. And again, this isn't that cultural backwardness mess from the 80s, the William Julius Wilson stuff about, you know, you're just culturally backwards. You can't do anything. You're born into poverty. I'm talking about material access, because that's the key thing here, is about resources, because if resources were there, this is not a problem. Whereas William Julius Wilson stuff in the 80s is saying, even if we have the resources, we still have a culture where we would just always act like we're poor criminals. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm challenging his craft to say that they specifically targeted resources to not be available or to not be available in abundance as a means of repression. Lacks well-funded public schools, lacks well-funded public hospitals. And I do a big piece on the privatization of Grady Hospital in the book and why it was targeted to be taken away from the Black working class. Lacks a special center with recreational events for social events for residents to enjoy. You got to drive to the city to enjoy anything. It's a mess, right? And so this is essentially where we currently are today, and it's growing. And the final part is the labor piece. Where are we at labor-wise? What does it look like? A 2024 Brookings Institute study said that 44% of all workers in the United States are in low-wage jobs with a median income of $18,000 a year. That's in 2024. I guarantee you, since all this foolishness over the past couple of years, that number's close to 50 right now. African Americans are disproportionately represented in low-wage work. Only 9.9% of mid-high level workers in the US are African American, middle, upper class. Therefore, you have a significant number of us higher than 44% that are in low-wage work. So I make the argument that 3/4 of the Black working class are in jobs where the wages do not meet or exceed the cost of living in the United States. Now, here are the job cuts just from 2025 alone. And again, I ain't put the ones up here from 2026 yet, but this is just 2025. And here's the reason I put these here is because in the past, when you've had job cuts, jobs were being created to replace those that were cut. There are no jobs that are replacing these, because when you look at the jobs reports today, you look at the actual types of jobs being created: restaurants, hotels, serving drinks, warehouse work, dollar stores. That's it. That's what's being created to replace these jobs. And that's what the dominant type of labor will be in the next 10 years. Sub-proletarian work, or sub-proletarian work. Now, how does this matter for the political economy? From 2000 to 2025, hospital services in the United States have gone up 281% in cost, college tuition 196%, child care nursery 158%, Medicare services 147%, housing 111%, food and beverages 105%, vehicles 25%, overall inflation 92% in 25 years. All the things that matter. Now, the things that have gone down in price in those 25 years: toys, TVs, because you can go and get a really nice TV now that used to be about $2,000. You can get a nice one now for about $250, right? Software, cell phone services. They got all these cell phone services now that don't cost anything. But the things you need to survive, this is the increase. Here are our wages in comparison in that same period. 4.3%. Our wages have only gone up 4.3% for 90% of the population, the working classes, over the last 25 years. This is why the sub-proletarianization thesis is applicable to understand what's happening to the working classes, a disproportionate number being Black and brown people. All right, I've got some stuff here about construction work and why you can't get into construction, but I know we're running out of time. So last thing in terms of today. So there are a bunch of spaces like this, and I know that we have them here in Detroit as well, where you have empty facilities that are not being used or abandoned. This place here, the John H. Lewis Gymnasium, this thing is 95,000 square feet, and it has been abandoned for 2 decades. And they're asking a ridiculous price so nobody can access it. This thing is big enough to even put a school in, to have to have a worker center. This thing can fit so many different things in, but the city, working with Friendship Baptist Church, doesn't want people to have access to the building, so it sits and just collects kudzu, the plants that don't die. And when I do this in Atlanta, they're like, yeah, they forgot the building was there because it's been closed for so long. But we have these spaces in urban areas that are costing us local movement resources that we can use. And so we got to always talk about that. I talked about the dollar store expansion, gig work, AI. I have a whole thing on artificial intelligence and automation related to the costing of these jobs. And of course, the extended stay motels. I talked a lot about this in the book because it's even gotten worse since the book came out. Extended stays are surging more now than ever. U.S. hotel construction pipeline reports that 39% of all U.S. construction in 2025 were extended stays. 43% of future projects will be extended stays. People can't afford housing anymore, and credit scores are jacked for apartments. So we go to extended stays to live. School buses have routes to extended stays now. That's how serious the housing crisis is. So just like here in Detroit, in Atlanta, you have neighborhoods of empty houses they just built that nobody can afford. So they go to the extended stay to live, and they're there for years. And I'm talking about some of the people there in the final chapter of the book. But this is why this is such an important thing for us to understand of the worker issue today, that we have to talk about the conditions today and tie it to the historical phenomenon happening in Atlanta and other urban spaces. And so I know this was a lot because I wanted to do the book stuff, but I also wanted to tie it to that the book is not just a historical book, that it's a book that you can use to look at the issues today for working people and understand that we have to start looking at the working classes and the material conditions if we're going to be serious about alleviating and intervening in what's been happening across the globe. So I'm hoping that this book serves as a ground version and other students and other people take up some of these frameworks and methods. And they may not agree with everything, but at least opening the door to studying the working classes in a serious way, where class is a point of analysis, because this is what's happening right now and it's a crisis. Thank you all so much for allowing me to do this presentation.